Welcome to Geopolitics Decanted. I'm your host, Dmitri Alperovitch, and this is a podcast where we go deep behind the headlines to analyze the pressing geopolitical issues of the day. Today, we have a special deep dive about North Korea, and I have two terrific people with me. First, my friend and occasional co-author, Sergey Radchenko, a professor at Johns Hopkins Science School and an author of a terrific recently released book, To Run the World, The Kremlin's Cold War Bid for Global Power. And a new guest for the show, I'm very excited to have Andrei Lankov with us. Andrei is perhaps the preeminent expert on North Korea in the West. He's a professor at South Korean Kookmin University, has visited North Korea numerous times, actually studied at Kim Il-sung's University in Pyongyang in the mid-1980s. He's also a director at NK News, a terrific news and analysis site about North Korea. Sergey, Andrei, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hi, Dmitri. Great to see you.
Terrific. Well, Sergey, let me begin with you. You and I have recently written a piece in the New York Times about the prospects for the Trump administration to potentially strike a peace deal with North Korea, resume the talks that had occurred during the first Trump presidency, and to perhaps formally bring the Korean War to an end so many years after it had began. Why don't you quickly describe our piece for the audience, and then we'll ask Andrei's take on it.
So thank you, Dmitri, for this and for the opportunity to talk about North Korea. In our piece, as you recall, we began with the premise that the so-called axis is an axis or would be axis that involves China, North Korea, Russia, potentially Iran, is actually not an axis at all, but actually is quite weak in the sense and could be exploitable. The differences between some of those players within this coalition could be exploitable, and we focused in particular on the weak link, North Korea. The starting point of the article was to highlight historical as well as contemporary reasons for why North Korea could be plied away from China and from Russia, because there is, of course, a view in the West that there's already a very firm alliance effectively between them. There's a triangle of some kind that is firm. There is, that is based on shared ideology, that is based on many shared interests, etc. And that the West simply just has to deal with this and not do anything about it. Well, our argument in the article was that by contrast, we should try to do something about it, and we should in particular continue the engagement that President Trump attempted in his first term with North Korea, because there are differences that could be exploited between both North Korea and China and North Korea and Russia. And in a part of our article, talk about historical differences between these three countries, focusing in particular on historical tensions between the Soviet Union, China, and Pyongyang, going back to really the 1950s. And Andrei knows the story very, very well. In 1956, there was effectively an attempt by Beijing and Moscow to undo a purge that Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of Kim Jong Un, unleashed in Pyongyang. Basically, the Russians and the Chinese sent a delegation to Pyongyang and forced him to undo a purge of the pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese faction. And Kim Il-sung did not like this idea, and it is at that point that he really tried to strike a very independent pose in relations with the two great powers. And now we know that policy by its name of Jucha, or independent,
self-reliance.
It was never really self-reliance economically, because of course North Korea continued to rely on the great power patrons. But politically, certainly he kept a distance. We talked also in the article about the experience of the 60s, when there was no love lost between China and North Korea. The Chinese, of course, had a radical period at that time during the Cultural Revolution, and Kim Il-sung wanted to have nothing to do with this whatsoever. In fact, a few listeners will have known that, but in 1969, there was a border clash between the Chinese and the North Koreans in the border area. So that is a very complicated history, certainly on the Chinese and North Korean side. Now, on the side in terms of relations with Russia, of course, they had historically a military alliance concluded in 1961. An alliance was recently concluded again in 2024. Some of the wording actually reflects the wording of the previous Treaty of Alliance that was signed in 1961. But the fact that North Korea and Russia or the Soviet Union had a military alliance from 1961 does not actually imply that the Russians were really willing at the moment's notice to come to North Korea's defense, because in fact, in the late 1960s, as North Korean foreign policy became radicalized, think about the capture of USS Pueblo, for example, in 1968, the Soviets were like, whoa, 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 what are you doing? When you're dragging us into a conflict with the United States, we have nothing to do with this. Just calm down, right? So this relationship was not really great.
The standard problems of entanglement with allies, right?
Exactly. They did not want to get entangled there. But then what really, the really interesting period was the late 1980s, because at that point, the Russians, or the Soviets at that time, saw the benefits of engagement with South Korea. And benefits like in money. They were being promised money for their engagement. And so they eventually, not just for money, I don't want to imply that Gorbachev was just bought by the South Koreans, because there were also all kinds of other reasons to engage with South Korea. But anyway, after 1988, especially after Seoul Olympics, the Soviets then increasingly turned to South Korea, even as Gorbachev had promised to the North Koreans that he would never establish contacts with or diplomatic relations with South Korea. But of course, he then went back on this promise. And then eventually, in 1990, there was a move towards effectively establishment of diplomatic relations. Gorbachev met Rosa Wu, the South Korean president, in San Francisco. Kim Il-sung was absolutely outraged by this. And we touched on some of these things in our article. And I apologize, Dmitry, for giving a longer version here, because not everything could go into the article. But basically, this was the point where the North Koreans were saying to the Soviets, look, you've discarded us like a worn-out shoe. We're going to pursue a nuclear program. And of course, fast forward to the present, we still have this situation where North Korea's relation with Russia, we argue, Dmitry, in our article, is very transactional. Yes, Kim Jong Un is providing ammunition and troops for Putin's invasion of Ukraine. The troops are currently fighting in Kursk, in Russia's Kursk region.
Technically, he's not providing the troops for the invasion of Ukraine, but for the defense of Russian territory against Ukrainian incursions.
Yes, let's be technically correct, right? They're not actually fighting in Ukraine, they're in Kursk. But it's a fundamental transactional relationship, because, of course, Kim Jong Un is receiving in return oil, grain, missile technologies, et cetera, et cetera. And the relation with China, we argue in our article, is also actually quite tense. Xi Jinping and Kim Jong Un have not met since 2019, but that's already 6 years, right? The relationship was supposed to be as close as that between lips and teeth, but in reality, there are all kinds of problems there. So basically what we argue is that, and this is, the punchline, the Trump administration should reach out to Pyongyang on a new basis, effectively recognizing that North Korea is not going to renounce its nuclear weapon, and try to normalize this relationship, establish a diplomatic relationship with Pyongyang.
So basically, to shorten that a little bit, we argue that the failure of the first two summits that they had in Singapore and Hanoi, was the focus on denuclearization, which was never going to be real, because that's the ultimate insurance policy for regime survival. But if you set that aside, there are other things you can get, both in terms of normalization of the relationship, but also goals that are worth pursuing on nonproliferation, to various actors like Iran, on ending of nuclear tests and aggressive missile launches and what have you, to moderate North Korean behavior and bring them in a little bit closer to us, although obviously they'll never abandon their attempt to sort of do this triangulation with China and Russia. So, Andrei, let me go to you. Feel free to criticize as viciously as possible our ideas, but we've had 3 summits between Trump and Kim, 2 official ones, and then one that Trump sort of called on a 24-hour notice at the DMZ, the very last one. Do you think the North Koreans would have any interest today, obviously a lot has changed now, to talk to Trump, to negotiate with him?
They might have some interest. Most likely they will. But conditions are going to be tougher than, say, back in 2019. I would completely agree with Sergey. The denuclearization is not a realistic idea. No matter how loudly people in the State Department say CVID, that is basically, very complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. They can tell as frequently as they like. It will have a zero impact on the situation. North Koreans have seen what has happened in Libya, in Iraq, and in Ukraine. And these three cases were wonderful subject lessons to explain that in the modern world, you should not believe any promises, Russian promises, American promises, Chinese promises, name it. The only guarantee of your survival, your state survival, or your regime survival, depends on the point of view, is, well, as usual, as it has been for the last 40,000 years, big guns. Well, big sticks used to be until a few centuries ago. So they are not going to negotiate it. But I believe that they might be interested in having a deal about arms control. But this time they will demand a really steep price from the United States, at least implicit acceptance of North Korea as a de facto nuclear state, economic sanctions being lifted, at least diplomatic recognition, or maybe something on top of that. Because this package would work very well in 2019. Maybe they will this time demand more. And in 2019, they were willing to surrender, so to say, only part of their nuclear facilities. The idea of the Hanoi Agreement, which did not work well, which was not really finalized, was that North Koreans would destroy all known nuclear research and production facilities, with a sort of understanding that they would keep something American intelligence failed to locate. It was also implied they would keep their nuclear devices, but after the destruction, after the physical demolition of their major research and development facilities, they would be unable to produce much more. Of course, they will be cheating. They would be cheating. No matter which agreement is made, North Koreans will cheat, period. But it will be much more difficult to cheat when you don't have all this necessary equipment. So, is this agreement good for them? They will consider the issue. I'm not sure whether they will accept it, but American side should understand. In comparison with 2019, Americans are going to pay more and get less because the situation changed. They have Russian money from ammunition and soldiers. They have Chinese support. They don't like China. They dislike Russia less than they dislike China, much less. But still, they would prefer to maybe have such a deal. But they are going to bargain much harder. And is it going to be acceptable for the administration? Is the American US Congress or media, are they not going to use it to accuse Donald Trump and his diplomats of being gutless, kowtowing to the evil tyrant and blah, blah, blah? I know not. But what I know, if the deal is not made, what will happen? Well, North Korea already have solid fuel ICBMs capable of hitting New York City and Washington. They will have much more such ICBMs and much better ICBMs. They have thermonuclear devices already, and they will have more. And if such a deal, people say, well, it's an acceptance of this dictatorship as a nuclear power. It's impossible, intolerable. Sorry, last time I checked, the US Congress and even the mighty US Senate cannot change laws of the nuclear physics and ballistics. They have nuclear devices which will explode, no matter what is written in the State Department papers. And if nothing is done, they will have many more such devices. So personally, 15 years ago, I wrote an article under a lengthy title, Why the US Will Eventually Accept North Korea as a Nuclear State. I basically have nothing to change in this article. My prediction were 10 to 15 years. If I remember correctly, it was 2010, so, maybe, which is not very common when you make predictions, maybe I was even right about timing. Yes, maybe I was wrong about timing, but once again, every new year without compromise means North Korean nuclear weapons getting more powerful and more dangerous.
And they proliferate as well, as we've seen with Syria, as we've seen with
Not
Iran.
so sure they might. I'm not so sure, but they might.
Well, they built a nuclear facility in
They
Syria
did,
that the
yeah.
Israelis bombed. But
And there were some strange stories in Myanmar, by the way. Some very strange stories in Myanmar.
So let me ask you this, Andrei, because we got criticized pretty heavily for our piece from the establishment here in Washington. And the two main arguments that people used against us and our ideas were that, one, the North Koreans have no interest in a deal, even if you set the denuclearization issue aside, because Kim Jong Un needs America as an enemy. And if he makes a deal, that weakens him internally in terms of propaganda to his people that the United States is intent to destroy the country. And that's why all the security services, all of the sufferings that the people are undergoing are justified. And then the second criticism was around the relationship with South Korea, that it would be permanently damaged if we attempt to pursue a deal like this, and would potentially push the Seoul to develop their own nuclear deterrent. How do you answer both of those?
First, will it damage the ideology? Not much. After all, the Soviet Union was fighting the world imperialism, at least on paper, while making deals with President Nixon and President Carter and even President Reagan. And you can always say to your own public that it was just another surrender of the American imperialists, who finally recognized our nuclear might and are begging for conditions of surrender. Why not? Number two is more serious. Yes, it will probably, not necessarily, push South Korea to develop its own nuclear weapons. But don't you think that half dozen more nuclear tests in North Korea and North Korean ICBM splashing waters in the California Bay or nearby in the Pacific will not have the same effect on the South Korean public? Well, basically, I have to admit, I have been converted about 7-8 years ago. Before that, I used to believe, that South Korea has no reasons to develop its own nuclear weapons. I have changed my mind. And once again, absence of such agreement will not mean that North Korea will stop its own nuclear program. On the contrary, it will mean that North Koreans will advance their nuclear program with greater effort and more energy. So I don't see how it will pacify South Korea. And frankly, the major problem why South Koreans are seriously considering going nuclear, and personally I believe they should seriously consider, is first, North Korean nuclear program, which began as a guarantee, as a way to make sure they will not suffer the fate of Libya and Iraq and Ukraine. This program changed its nature around 2015-16 from defensive, from deterrence-oriented program, and began to develop into a program of offensive nature. In the long run, the long-term goal is to create chances that a future war in Korea, the Second Korean War, could be initiated and won by North Korea. Americans should be blackmailed from any involvement with ICBM, something like, you gentlemen want to save Seoul, well, you are losing San Francisco. And then using tactical nukes, low-yield nukes, which can be really used on battlefields, to win a war with the South Korean armed forces. It's a dream, and I'm not saying it's going to happen right now, but they are working on this, and South Koreans see it, and they don't like it. It's
Let
number
me
one.
ask you, Andrei,
Yep.
about the recent changes you've seen in North Korea in the last year, where Kim is seemingly abandoning the idea, obviously the dream from his grandfather of unification of the Korean Peninsula. He's changed the constitution to describe South Korea as a principal enemy. What is all that about?
It's different in this case. I think it's basically a good idea in one regard. It's an admission of reality I am supporting. But the major goal for him is to neutralize the South Korean impact on the North Korean society he doesn't like. Because it's a bit of schizophrenia right now. You can go to prison for, well, not necessarily watching, but for at least making copies of South Korean video. And at the same time, South Koreans are supposed to be your brothers and sisters. A bit of contradictions, isn't it? And now it's simple. It's a hostile country waging hostile propaganda full of hostile ideology. So, well, it's understandable. And in the long run, they probably want to do what East Germans tried to do unsuccessfully. That is to create a new separate national identity, to construct a North Korean nation full scale with national identity, which would be different from the South Korean nation. I think they have chances to succeed, but it will take a long time.
Then why wage a war to take over the South if you're a separate
You
nation?
know, the states have a wonderful habit over last, well, since, well, say, probably early Neolithic, they have had a wonderful habit of waging wars. And developing this idea of the Second Korean War, say in the year 2047 or later, first stage,
For the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the state.
Yeah, maybe a bit later. The Americans are neutralized by blackmail using ICBM and threats of nuclear strike against major American cities. Tactical nukes are used to wipe out the South Korean units. And then, well, unification. Many smart people began to ask it many years ago. They said that North Korea cannot swallow South Korea anyway, even if they score a military victory.
Have half the
So
population.
much larger population, twice the size. And don't tell me about low fertility in South Korea. It's true, but fertility is very low and falling in North Korea as well. Having said that, so ratio is not going to change much. And it's much more advanced. So it will be much better if they win a war, just to treat it as a foreign state, which, well, lost a war with you. And we have seen many examples to disband their military, to establish control over some, if you like, Hong Kongization or Finlandization of Korea, of South Korea. So I don't see any contradictions with all these ideas that South Korea is a separate state. The major goal is to justify policy aimed at maximum isolation of the North Korean people from the South Korean popular culture and any dangerous knowledge about South Korean prosperity, because South Korea is dangerously successful.
So let me ask you this. You both have just returned from China, from a trip to China, where you met with your colleagues there. Let me ask you about your impressions, particularly in connection with North Korea and Chinese views on North Korea. So Sergey, let's start with you.
So that was a very interesting trip. And of course, I used to live in China. I spent years in China, but then I left at a certain point and I hadn't been going back because of COVID and various things that happened. So I've decided to re-engage and spend some time there. So I did, go to different places in China, including Nanjing, Beijing, ultimately to Sanya, where Andrei also was. So we had a very interesting experience and conversations, or at least I had conversations with the Chinese colleagues. And what struck me most from that is there are a couple of points. First is that I even underestimated the extent of, I would say, a frustration in Beijing with North Korea. There is really they are just so annoyed with Kim Jong Un. There is a sense of genuine entrapment. What are these people doing? Why
specifically because of the relationship with Russia, or
yes,
broader?
specifically because of the relationship with Russia. They don't like to be dragged into any kind of triangles or any kind of, coalitions or alliances with the Russians and the North Koreans. But they are in a difficult position. And that, of course, takes us a little bit beyond North Korea, because the Chinese, on the one hand, they don't want to be associated with any kind of axis. On the other hand, they also approach geopolitics the world from a very geopolitical perspective, so to speak. In other words, they see Russia and North Korea as pieces on a chessboard, and they don't want to be in a situation where they're forced to sacrifice one or the other because they feel that this will weaken their own geopolitical position. So they don't like what Putin is doing. They don't like what the North Koreans are doing. But when push comes to shove, they also don't want to be seen in a position where they make concessions on those issues to the West, because that would weaken them strategically, that would weaken them geopolitically. So I found that interesting dual situation where they're frustrated on the one hand, but on the other hand, they also feel like China is being outplayed and it has to hold on to its partners, allies, or whatever you call them, and work with them, and not put itself in a situation where it has to distance itself from them, and in sort of not I don't know if I'm kind of conveying this accurately. So this is one thing that came across very clearly in my conversations in Beijing.
And is there issue the fear that they'll be dragged into more entanglement in this conflict in Ukraine, or is the issue that they don't like that their vassal state, North Korea, that is so highly dependent on them, now has other options, now receiving money, military technologies from Russia, and perhaps is not as dependent?
It's both, right? It's both. Of course, they cannot like the fact that North Korea, that is supposed to be a vassal state after all, historically, traditionally, is now doing its own thing. And I bet you they were not informed about the treaty that was about to be signed, or at least if they were informed, they were not, consulted on this subject, or about the treaty between Russia and North Korea. I'm sure they're not very happy about this. They also don't want to be dragged into any kind of confrontation involving Ukraine, obviously, as we know from our study of China's approach to Russia. At the same time, they don't want to throw Putin under the bus. That's where the contradiction comes from, right? They don't like what Putin is doing. They don't want to throw him under the bus. How do you reconcile these two problems? How do you kind of talk through this? Because there's an internal contradiction in their position. And I think they realize there's an internal contradiction. But one thing they want to make very clear is that they don't want a triangle. So that's one point. The other point that was going to be that I discussed in Beijing and with colleagues, etc., is that they are really worried about de facto nuclear status for Pyongyang, and they're worried about it even more than I think the Americans are worried about it, for a different set of reasons. So they are worried not only that South Korea could go nuclear, okay, that's pretty bad, but then you have also Japan, and the worst case scenario for them is that Taiwan could go nuclear, and that is, I felt, was a real genuine concern. Like, well, wait a second, if Taiwan goes
That's
nuclear,
not very realistic, though, but yeah.
well, it was discussed. This is something they worried about. They worry about nuclearization of all of Northeast Asia and East Asia, and as a result of that, China's interest being somehow further undermined compared to American interests. In other words, who benefits from Japan, South Korea, and from their perspective, God forbid.
And do you think this is what's driving their desire to increase dramatically their nuclear arsenal, or do they have any sort of self-reflection that perhaps their vast expansion of missile silos and warhead numbers perhaps is contributing to the desire of other countries to have their own nuclear weapons?
I think that's not what's driving the increase of nuclear arsenals. I think what's driving the increase of nuclear arsenals is them increasingly thinking in Cold War terms. So they're facing a situation that you might say is reminiscent of the Cold War. And so they're going back to history books and they're asking, well, what is it about the Cold War that we now have to learn from? What were some of the historical experiences? It was a nuclear confrontation. Okay, well, let's make sure that we're not in a position of weakness, and therefore that we're at least bringing up our nuclear arsenals to some kind of parity with the other great powers, nuclear powers, i.e. Russia and the United States. And I think that has been going for some time now, right? It's not a new development. It's been unfolding over months and years and will continue to unfold. And I think it is simply a reflection of China trying to reconceptualize its foreign policy in Cold War terms. Now, are they prepared to wage a Cold War? I'm not 100% convinced that they are, but they are taking steps which they think will improve their chances in a Cold War standoff with the United States, i.e. increasing their nuclear capabilities.
Okay. Andrei, what were your takeaways?
Well, basically very similar, but I was less surprised because I have been visiting China and talking to the Chinese for a long time. See, above all, I would describe their reaction as uncertainty about North Korea being slipping away from their sphere of interest. Personally, I believe that these fears are exaggerated, and what I usually tell the Chinese, and I did tell it again just 2 days ago, that they should not worry, because in the end of the day, Russia is both unwilling and unable to replace China as the major sponsor of North Korea. The current relations between Russia and North Korea are unlikely to survive the end of hostilities in Ukraine. Economies of Russia and North Korea are not mutually compatible. Items which North Koreans can sell with profits at the world market are of little or no interest for Russia, with a couple of exceptions. Most important exception is basically cheap labor. North Korean workers. But
because most of their exports are minerals and Russia has no need for them.
Absolutely. Plus seafood, plus light industry. It's a different story why China can benefit from North Korean light industry and Russia cannot. It will simply take a couple of minutes. Probably will not waste it now. But yeah. Essentially, 40% of their export before all the sanctions, all this COVID-related mess was coal. Yeah. So I usually say I would see that this Chinese war is about, Russian influence as somewhat irrelevant. Bit kind of more psychology than real politics, but it's quite present. They are quite present, I would say. And talking about relations between China and North Korea, there is a great deal of mistrust on both. And it has always been the case. Always been the case. We should never forget that North Koreans are playing their own game. And they are, why I like to talk to the North Korean officials and diplomats? Unofficially. Because they are ideology free. Yes. Their only ideological commitment I can see is commitment to having, not only preserving their state, which is kind of cynically speaking rational, but preserving it as independent from foreign control as possible. They don't want to be anybody's puppet, even if such option is well paid. And this is ideology because it goes against their rational interest. Or maybe not, because if you have a puppet master, the puppet master can try to change you, as basically
most
Sergey
states don't
mentioned.
want to be
yes,
controlled by other neighbors, right? So
at any way, yes, at any way. But otherwise, they're very pragmatic, very smart people for whom, if say Americans, it's a sort of open secret that for many years, maybe not anymore, but for a couple of decades, they were seriously talking to the Americans about such an interesting possibility. What if the North Korea, becomes a de facto ally of the United States and the kind of their major unsinkable aircraft carrier for a nice reward? Of course, it was not going to happen, but the fact they discussed it. And if you are outraged, I would dare to remind you that Americans made a deal with China in the 1970s, when Chairman Mao was still alive, and China, was far, far more brutal than it is now. When the US media is full of talks about this evil China, the democratic country cannot cooperate with. By some reasons, far less democratic, far more repressive China did not create much trouble back in the 1970s. And you know what? They had a common enemy. And it made them to overlook all these high principles. Yeah, and for the North Koreans, it's even more pronounced.
But you don't think the North Koreans see China as an enemy, do they?
They see everybody. Yes, they do. I would say they see as a potential enemy every single country. To some extent, if you like, Indonesia. But it's too far away and too insignificant from their point of view. Because they see the world as, as a zero-sum game. They don't believe in any serious commitment. There are maybe some very limited, very restricted exceptions to this rule. For example, strangely enough, I believe they have a touch of sympathy towards Russia. But they see Putin's Russia as a country which has finally found its right way, finally realized that it committed many sins and now is trying to basically, go the righteous way. But let's not overestimate. They see it's a kind of classical hard-nosed Machiavellian kind of realist school.
Let me ask you about one other country, which is, we've covered two of the potential partners in this so-called axis that Sergey and I don't accept, Russia and China. But what is the relationship between Iran and North Korea?
Iran and North Korea are transactional, and it has been the case for many years because since the 1980s, since after the Islamic revolution in Iran, they were basically dealing with Iran. It was military cooperation. They were selling missiles to Iran when the Iranian government was fighting with Saddam government in Iraq. Let's not forget they were mortal enemies. The North Korean ballistic missiles were widely used. The Iranians launched few dozen, about 80 something, if I remember correctly, North Korean ballistic missiles targeting Iraqi cities. And then there was a great deal of cooperation with nuclear weapons program, with delivery systems, with everything. But again, if you believe that Iranian government has any sympathy for the godless communists or godless whoever chuchists, they are not really communists, or that Kim Jong Un has some sympathy towards Islam, you are absolutely wrong. It's just transactional.
They were getting paid.
Alliance of two parties, maybe slightly stimulated by their anti-American feelings, but as I have said, we should not overestimate. You know what is again, when you're talking to North Korean officials, diplomats, everybody, they are just, this hard-nosed realists. When you talk to Americans, you see Americans really believe in their ideology. In many other countries, you see it to varying degree. By the way, America is unusually ideological place, but it's not North Korea. It's a classical realist school.
So could I push, Dmitry, could I just push back on both of you actually and play the devil's advocate here with regard to this ideological aspects? Okay, we could say that they're all transactional. North Koreans are transactional, the Chinese are transactional, the Russians are transactional, the Iranians are transactional, and that's probably true at some level. But would you also say that they have a shared vision of the world or not? Do they not have a shared vision of the world? In particular, this notion that American hegemony is something that they should strive towards overturning.
But that's just part of the vision of the world, right? So Iranians have a very particular vision of the world as it relates to their control or an influence in the Middle East. That's probably not shared by Russia or China, right? So they have differences tactically.
On how we see ideology. If we see ideology as something really comprehensive, system of thought and governance, etc., that orders one society, then yes, there's very little in common between them. There's very little in common. But if you look at, for example, Russian-North Korean interaction, you could make the argument that they do share some kind of a broad idea about, authoritarianism, for example, or some broad idea about anti-Americanism. This is, of course, Dmitry, this is the argument that some folks in Washington have used against us, right? They're saying, well, you underestimate this question of their shared vision of the world. I mean, Andrei, where would you stand on this?
I would say, well, with Iranians, I believe, because they're essentially a religious government, we have seen that churches and church people can be very cynical, but never 100% cynical. So they have some share of belief that, the happiness of Shia Islam they are going to bestow on the suffering world is something, worth fighting for. Maybe it's just on the margins. But talking about North Korea, I would not agree. Because yes, they are very anti-American right now. But if they make political decisions, if they see that they are getting enough money from the United States, they can switch sides instantly. It's a fantasy, but as I have said, some people in North Korea did entertain this fantasy for quite a long time. If, say, Donald Trump says something like, I'm going to give you 10 times your normal annual income, and you allow us to, position some our air force on your territory and use your port facilities and everything. I'm showering you with money. I'm not asking questions about what's happening in your prison camps. I'm not sure with it. I don't think they will say no. Of course, it's not going to happen. It's a fantasy. But let's understand that let's not overestimate their ideological commitment. They used to have it decades ago, but not anymore.
Yeah. So let me ask you about the other piece of this from a regular people ideology, maybe not regular people, but the North Korean soldiers in Russia that have been sent there. They were initially denigrated by some officials in the US, saying, oh, they're just watching porn because they're getting access to that for the first time. But now, particularly talking to the Ukrainians, they're being very complimentary of these troops, of their fighting capabilities, their bravery, and particularly their intent to not surrender alive. In fact, they recently captured, of course, two, and went through enormous difficulties in getting them alive, because ordinarily the North Koreans pull the grenade pin, put it next to their head, and explode before you get close to them. What is going on with this? Who are these people that are being sent? Are these, you think, regular military, special forces?
No, slightly elite, but not regular, who are, sons of the low-level elite. By American standards, I would say low middle class.
And why are they so committed to not being taken alive, dying for Kim?
I will not tell you a funny long Russian joke about it, which I usually have. I had few minutes. I will have to be short about it. It was about why Russian bodyguards of Russian General Secretary, Soviet General Secretary, were much more willing to die than bodyguards of the US President. Yes. When they ordered to die, it was said an American Secret Service guy and a Russian FSO back then, Department 9 guy said, I have family. It means basically if they die, if they commit suicide, if they are not taken prisoners. We have seen it many times, in the early 2000s, Japanese intercepted North Korean spy vehicle, and all people committed suicide, all people aboard. During an unsuccessful mission in South Korea mid-1990s, a North Korean submarine ran aground ambulance. And they evacuated when they understood that it would be impossible to get back to North Korea. They did try. They committed suicide and so on. Why? Because if you commit suicide, your family will be taken care of. And the family will get a lot of money, ability to get to good schools, good jobs, everything. If not, well, I'm not saying your family will go to a prison camp. Most likely not, but it might go. Most likely not, but it will be a family of traitors. And sorry, your son or your nephew will never be accepted to a good school, or maybe any school, and will have to spend all her life doing manual work in the countryside, and so on and so on and so on. So it's plus general education, because people ask about these people, aren't they going to be, are their families going to be unhappy about these people being killed? Well, North Koreans, since the kindergarten, they're getting education that, wars happen. States sometimes fight wars. We should always fight for our state, which is always right, righteous and right. And we should be ready to die, because during wars people are getting killed. By the way, just 100 years ago, have you talked to an average French or American or British person, say 1910, you would hear very similar answers. So it's not something unusual. It's unusual in the modern world, and I'm not sure why it has become unusual. Is the world warmer and kinder place? Or maybe just the structure of, the period of US hegemony changed it for a while, forever, I don't know. But anyway, their mentality is a bit like, say, Europe before the First World War.
Yeah.
And on top of
the
that,
family pays the price.
Yes, on top of that, you have the system when their families are essentially hostages. Well, so why not? And they're watching porn, well, young males and females sometimes too like this stuff, why not? Right, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they are not brave enough or smart enough.
Yeah. So I want to take the opportunity because we have you and you're such a deep expert on what the regular life in North Korea is like that I want to ask you some questions about that. So first of all, I want to ask you the Gulag system, the prison camp system, how big is it? How many people are in it and how severe is the life in that prison camp system?
Talking about severity, there are different levels in the prison system. If you are in the total control zone, it's very bad. Your chances of survival are not very high. In the same camp, they can have two zones. In some camps it's only one zone. And if it's revolutionization zone, the assumption is that, well, probably you will die, but it's also possible you will basically be released eventually. Talking about the size, the satellite pictures are usually used. And there have been some studies about the size of their prison camp population. And unlike the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, they keep political prisoners camps and common criminals camps separate. So you can know not the number of people who are in prison, but roughly the number of political prisoners, which would be impossible, say, have we just had satellite pictures of Joseph Stalin camps. Of course, satellites didn't exist back then. But so the most recent estimate was around 2015, and they were talking about 80,000 people in prison camps back then, 80,000 to 100,000, which was actually a significant decline if you compare it with the numbers of the, say, late last century of the 1990s.
Less than 1% of the population.
Yes, their population is about 25 million, so it's about 0.3-0.4%, which is basically, if you compare it with the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, it's slightly below, but very close.
Yeah. And then the surveillance system itself, there's a system called Inminban, I think,
Yes.
right? That is
And
sort of like
yeah.
a neighborhood watch where
Yes.
People are watching you and your family. How does that work?
Basically, every single North Korean should be a member of this mutual surveillance group, usually consisting of couple of 2 or 3, 4 dozen families. You have an official assigned to you. It's always a woman, not usually, always a woman, usually middle-aged woman, whose duty is to visit your house. It's her duty, and you cannot say no
come
if she
inside
drops in.
your house.
She's a woman from one of the, say, 35 families.
Mm-hmm.
And she is responsible. She's visiting and she's checking your income. She is looking how much furniture you have and everything. They conduct random midnight checks just to make sure that nobody is staying on premises without proper registration. Because if your friends, even living in the same city, if you want to have, an overnight stay, persons who are staying in your house should go to this lady and do formal registration. Produce ID, just make necessary records in the registration book, and then it's okay, it's legal. And if they come from outside your province or your city, they should also present a travel permit, because technically you cannot leave your city of residence or province of residence. It's very complicated system, but in a nutshell, you cannot leave it without securing a special travel permit from the police. So it's a bit like visa for visiting to a foreign country, but in this case you need sort of government visa to go to a neighboring province, and so on. And the duty of this official is to meet with responsible police officer, both criminal police and political police, and report everything suspicious she sees in her neighborhood. And on top of that, it's used for labor mobilization, for cleaning the city, washing up, planting trees, social services too, by the way. It's not always about, spying on you. It's sometimes about having you, looking after an old lady who cannot go shopping. And it's also a part of their duties. And on top of that, every single person belongs to a particular organization and his or her workplace, where 3 times per week indoctrination sessions and similar system, somewhat different, will not go into detail. I have written quite a lot about it. Just Google it. But somewhat different, but essentially similar system of surveillance at your workplace. And this is the reason why now, when many of their factories are not operational, the North Korean government does not want to let people who have nothing to do at these factories, they don't want to let these people go. Because the assumption is once they come to a factory, factories are idle. Nothing is produced. In some cases, even equipment was partially sold to China as scrap metal. But people are still required to come every morning and spend there a few hours because the authorities should know where they are. And it's a very interesting topic. I can talk for hours about how it works and all kind of interesting, sometimes funny, unintended or intended side effects of the system. Like one of the side effects was a massive economic power of women. Empowerment of women.
Because they're the spies.
Yeah, because women can officially register themselves as housewives and don't attend work. And it means they have time to be engaged in far more lucrative, far more profitable private economy.
Yeah.
Anyway, but here it's very efficient control.
I want to ask about the tech aspect as well. They have their own operating system. They don't use Windows on their computers, but they developed Red Star OS, which is
Linux.
a version of North
It's
Korean
fake. It's fake.
Linux version.
Yeah, Linux. It's Linux. It's what they say, but it's not their system. They just made some minor adjustments for the security reasons in Linux.
So I wanted to ask about what are those adjustments? Is it surveillance features? What do they have in that operating system?
First of all, you cannot open any audio or video file. By the way, there is an interesting research by Human Rights in North Korean Committee, Digital Trenches, strongly advised to Google, with all technical details. Basically, in a nutshell, you cannot open an audio or video file from USB stick or any kind of outside device. You can exchange files using the local intranet. They are not connected. Only officials with security clearance have connection to the internet. But they have a fairly well-developed intranet, domestic local system. But you can get exchanged files through this system, but government is
you have
monitoring
like an internal email that works within the country, but not
everything.
To
they have everything, but it can be easily controlled by the government. And if you just take a USB, which was probably dropped from a South Korean balloon or God knows what, it will not be working. Number two, is the system, the Red Star Linux, makes random shots of their screen, and it cannot be deleted. So, because all computers should be registered with police, and police makes random check rates of your computers, an officer can just say, well, Comrade Kim, let's have a look what you saw in, say, last Tuesday. And there is a screenshot. This Captain Park sees that you were watching South Korean movie, and you're in trouble unless you can pay Captain Park a sufficiently large bribe. It's a very corrupt place. You should not forget about it. So basically, this type of control. Essentially the major idea, it cannot be used to watch any kind of an unauthorized files. There is
it has to be digitally signed, right? Or it can be open.
Digitally signed by the government officials. They have a program which is specially designed to do it. When it's done, it's okay. Or you can get it through basically intranet connection, because in this case, it's also easily checkable.
Now, Andrei, throughout my career in cybersecurity, I've dealt with many North Korean hackers, and they've always amazed me by their great deal of expertise, their innovative approaches. I've called them the most innovative nation state actor
Mhm.
I've ever encountered. Why are they so good? Is there a good system for talent spotting of
Yes.
kids when they're in
Yeah.
school, and those that are proficient in math and physics and other STEM education fields, to pick the best and train them
Yes.
into the hacker corps within the RGB, the Reconnaissance General Bureau?
Yes. And Kim Jong Il, the father of the current leader who was running the country from in the 1990s, basically until his death in 2011, 1994 to 2011, Kim Jong Il made a very interesting decision. He basically decided not to care much about family background of people who were good in STEM subjects.
So you can be a son of a traitor and still be
You
picked.
could be grandson of somebody who escaped to South Korea, or grandson of a female shaman, and nobody would care if you know what to do with calculus, if you are very good with calculus. So for a significant part of the ambitious young boys, there is a strong gender discrimination. But women also have some chances, but overwhelmingly it's for the boys. For them, it suddenly became a way of social advance. So if you are good in math and STEM, especially military-related STEM, you can get out of your God-forgotten village. You can start eating pork or beef almost, well, not beef, pork and chicken almost every day. Eggs maybe every day. You will have an apartment which will be warm in winter. Isn't it nice? So
But you,
people,
as a hacker, you may actually be sent overseas to China or Malaysia and operate from there, right?
yes, yeah. But I think that significant part of their hackers are operating from inside the country. Even though, yes, they have this basis in a lot of kind of, I would say, bases, should we say, maybe in Manchuria, in Shenyang, and in Kuala Lumpur, and so on. And it's not only about getting intel; it's also about making money.
Yeah. And making money, one of my understandings is that you have these hackers that are obviously procuring secrets and trying to get intelligence, both industrial intelligence and national security intelligence for the country. But they're also, there's a great deal of money making that's taking place. They're engaged in cryptocurrency schemes and all sorts of ransomware operations. And my understanding is the reason that is being done is that they're working for an agency who may not have the full budget allocated to them to do the missions that are being tasked to them by the leadership. So you find
Mhm.
other ways to compensate for the budget shortfall, engage in crime and smuggling operations and the like. Is that true?
It's how it began back in the 1970s, when the North Koreans in the late 1970s got a brilliant idea that their spies should earn money to pay for their operations, and their embassies should be self-supporting.
It's brilliant.
But it's still the case to some extent, but it's a bit of simplification now, because many of these agencies are created not to earn money for, to pay for espionage operations, even if they exist under some kind of intel services control, but just to earn money. This money are partially going to the budget of these agencies, which are not necessarily using it to bribe State Department officials in Washington to get top secret documents, maybe for far more pedestrian use. And some of this money goes straight to the government coffers, to the budget of the central government and the family royal budget, which is difficult to distinguish in many cases. Yes, it began as a way to subsidize uh, activities which are not normally seen as money-making activities in other countries. But it began from the military. The first ideas in the mid-1970s by Ojinu, when they established the very first foreign trade companies. It was about providing the soldiers with some basic consumer goods. But now it's, to a very large extent, is just about money making, pure and simple money making.
I mean, the innovation is really staggering. Not only are they engaged in criminal activities, but they're also doing semi-legitimate tasks. One of the big scams that is being perpetrated right now is this IT worker situation where North Koreans are being hired by companies, large and small, across the United States, pretending to be South Koreans, Taiwanese, Singaporeans,
Chinese,
and
Malaysians, whoever.
getting hired in many cases by numerous companies at the same time, 5, 10, and showing up trying to do work. Of course, if you're working for 10 companies at a time, you're not going to do your best work, but the primary purpose is actually to collect a paycheck, not to steal anything. And the US government has identified them to belong to Department 53 of the Ministry of the People's Armed Services, which is the main weapons trading entity subordinate to the Ministry of National Defense.
Yeah, basically their hacking operations can be divided at the first approximation into 3 groups. First, they're just doing normal intel activity. They are trying to get secret intel of all kinds. Normal espionage. And they are remarkably good for a small country in this activity. Absolutely brilliant. Most countries of their size and income simply cannot afford such intel gathering operations on even remotely similar scale. Number 2, they do essentially stealing all kind of crypto crime. Not necessarily crypto crime. Sometimes they steal all good digital fiat currencies. US dollars,
bank theft, etc.
Yes, basically they are stealing from electronic accounts of usually their favorable targets, talking about ideology. They love to talk how much they love the developing world and what is called now in the political parlance the global south. But if you look at their largest cyber theft operations, it's always in the global south, including countries on paper they love Vietnam, but it did not prevent them from stealing obscenely large amount of money from a Vietnamese company. Bangladesh is a great friend, but a few years ago, a significant amount of money somehow disappeared from the central bank of Bangladesh as a result of their efforts. It's number 2. And number 3 is, as you have mentioned, something which is perfectly legal. It's illegal only because of UNSC, UN Security Council, sanctions system. So it's just a way to make money. And as you have said, because of sanctions, they usually pretend to be South Koreans or Chinese or Malaysians or whoever. And maybe in some cases they take too many orders and they cannot meet the deadline. But once again, cannot you tell it about yourself? I can tell about myself. Sometimes I accept too many orders and cannot handle it properly. But it doesn't mean that it's what I normally do. So, to the best of my knowledge, in most cases, I wouldn't say hackers, these computer designers,
IT workers.
IT workers teams produce very good product for very cheap cost.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I've dealt with a few of these cases in the last year. They don't often show up to meetings because they have too many jobs. They're getting too greedy, and the work product has dropped dramatically. But let me ask you a couple of questions about Kim, and we can wrap up. First of all, Kim's sister. I'm fascinated by her, Kim Yo-jong. How powerful is she in the system? Does she call a lot of the shots? Is he relying on her because she's loyal? What's going on with her?
With Kim Yo-jong, we don't know domestic scene good enough. But what is very often overlooked, her rise follows an established pattern in the Kim family. Let's go back to the late 1950s. Around 1958-59, Kim Il-sung, the founder, Kim I, began to consider a family succession. But his first son, future Kim II, Kim Jong-il, at the time was in his late teens, so he was too young to be a successor. What did Kim Il-sung do? He took his brother, Kim Yong-ju, and appointed him, put him in charge of the most important department of the Central Committee, Organization and Guidance Department, OGD, responsible for personal appointments. And Kim Yong-ju remained number 2 or number 3 in North Korean official hierarchy. In such a capacity, by the way, he was negotiating with the South Koreans when there was the first ever round of North-South negotiations in the early 1970s, 1972. But then the real successor got old enough. Kim Jong-il was actually finally confirmed as successor around, say, in the early 1970s. It's again more complicated picture. There is a good research by Fyodor Tertitsky if you are interested. But generally in the early 70s he was confirmed. And Kim Jong-un, his uncle, disappeared. When I was a student, we believed back in 1982 that he had been killed. It was not the case. Now we know what happened. He was sent to a very comfortable exile in the countryside.
Retired.
Completely cut off from the political, yes, for a couple of decades. Then he was recalled back to the capital, given a politically meaningless but well-paid and very honorable job, and lived until very old age. I don't remember whether he was basically 100 years old or something when he died. The second round, Kim Jong-il decided to follow the way of his father. It was sort of assumed. But his son was way too young, in teens. And what did he do? Kim Jong-il had no brothers. He had half-brothers whom he distrusted. But he had a sister. So he made his sister's husband, Chan Son-hek, a member of the top leadership. And when Kim Jong-il's health began to deteriorate, Chan Son-hek was made sort of responsible for the succession and the first years of rule of Kim Jong-il's son and successor, the current leader, Kim Jong-un, the current leader. However, Kim Jong-un was tougher than his father in many regards in this too. Basically, the rise of his father meant that his father's uncle was just sent to comfortable exile. Kim Jong-un's rise meant that his, well, not exactly uncle, he had none but Aun's husband, well, he was just executed.
Is it true that he was executed with an anti-aircraft gun, or is that a myth?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't think so, frankly, because he was royal blood. It's like in old medieval world. Yeah, in medieval world, you could get some common criminal and let the local population enjoy this criminal's public torture or whichever. But when somebody was of royal blood, old good clean beheading. It would be a bad idea to do something too, I would say, gory to a person from the family, starting from the capital F.
They connecting the subject of executions. Is it true that the people who worked on U.S. North Korean rapprochement under the previous Trump administration were later executed by Kim Jong-un?
Well, I would be very careful in saying so. Usually I'm skeptical about such statements, but in this particular case, and in relation to this particular group of people, it seems I have highly reliable confirmation to your statement. Yes, seemingly they will.
So if they try it again, they'll have to,
Get a new team.
to be in their position, if you know what I mean.
Well, anyway, they will be just a bit careful. Kim Jong-un is basically a smart guy, but sometimes too capricious. And when you have an absolute monarchy, essentially the way to understand North Korea is to see it as an absolute monarchy.
Medieval monarchy.
Medieval monarchy, absolutely. Well, absolute monarchy is medieval by default, maybe late medieval, early modern. So it's basically say things about some French or Russian or Persian kings or sultans in, say, the 14th century. Similar situation. Having said that, yes, finishing. And now Kim Jong-un. Absolutely same picture. The successor is too young to be taken seriously, so the current leader's sibling is appointed to run the show. So, as I have said, it's an established tradition.
But she's a sister, not her husband. I don't know if she's married or not.
If she's married, why? Belated information. She has 2 kids.
Okay. So why not?
Shown on TV on the 1st of January this year.
So are they
1 month
becoming
ago.
much more feminist and allowing women in position
Yes.
of leadership?
Yes, is what I keep saying. He's a crypto-feminist. As my wife says, he spent his youth in the parts of the world where they began to suspect that females are human too. Having said that, he is appointing women to very powerful positions, like Jason Kim. Yes, she is of high-level family, prime minister's daughter, but under his father, Miss Chue would have no chances to become even ambassador to Zimbabwe, let alone foreign minister, and before that, head of the American Department. Or Hyun Sung-wol, he's Kim Jong Un's chief secretary. It's a big job, really, to be head of the personal office of the leader, and it would be unthinkable to give such a job to a female. And I belong to a group of people. I would not bet on it, but I think that there are good reasons to believe that the girl we can often see on this kind of TV, a girl we usually call Kim Jong-un. I'm not 100% certain of whether it's real name, but there are some indications recently that it is. I'm inclined to believe she is a successor.
His daughter.
Maybe he has no children, or maybe he has a son, but looks like he chose a daughter. And
in the Korean culture, I mean, it is a very kind of male-dominated culture. Do you think there'll be any issues in accepting a woman leader?
Yes, there might be, and this might be the reason why he began to promote his daughter that early, to get people adjusted.
There's an IR theory that suggests that women are more peaceful, and or states that are led by women are more peaceful in their outlook. You think North Korea will become more peaceful in that circuit?
Catherine the Great in Russia, Catherine II, was presiding over the period of the most successful territorial conquest.
That's why it's
and yes,
historians to talk
and
theories.
England
Elizabeth
was
I
run.
did not do so
Yes.
bad either.
And good old England began to build the foundation of its empires when it was run by a woman in the late 18th century. So I'm not so sure. I believe in this case I'm completely gender neutral. It's a funny story which might be used for some ideological debate, but I don't think it has serious relations to the reality. It works both ways. But having said that, it looks like Kim Jong Un is indeed willing to promote women, and according to some reliable stories, apart from the symbolic figures, he also introduced quotas for women in all positions of power. So according to the stories, over the last few years, local mid-ranking, even high-ranking, among mid-high-ranking officials, I mean real officials who are really running the place, not this kind of persons for show, like the rubber stamp parliament or everything, but real people. There should be a certain minimum number of women. Quota system.
I'll tell you
affirmative action system.
This is very concerning, because if North Korea is practicing DEI, we may not have a successful negotiation with Donald Trump. So this can be an issue.
I believe Cheson he can, with all due respect. Yes, and it's probably DEI on the right way, because, as you have said, there used to be a massive discrimination against women, and he's trying to fix it. And probably it's actually, on balance, it will release a great deal of talent, which before had been neglected or suppressed. So it's probably a good idea. Apart from the general ideas of equality, just pragmatically from the state point of view, he is using a massive pool of talent, which for centuries has been neglected.
But it also sounds like, at least based on the historical record, if you're Kim Yo-jong, the sister, you should be expecting to be either retired or executed once the successor is in place, right?
To be a regent is a dangerous job. I'm sort of proud that they did say it in press about Chan Song-hek when he was appointed. And they said that, well, a young, ambitious prince and his uncle as a regent, it sometimes doesn't end up well. And they was right.
Yeah.
But maybe it can go other ways. If both they can find some kind of common knowledge for a successful region, it's very important either to make a decisive grab for power or, in the right time, resign and completely forget about any political ambitions. Do aerobics, read novels, write novels if you like, enjoy time with your grandchildren, and don't react even to hints of getting back to the politics.
Well, if you're listening, Kim Jong, you're
Yeah.
getting career advice from Andrei Lankov. That's
Absolutely,
very
like,
important.
talking about monarchy. And regent tell to young prince, Your Majesty, you have reached your greatness, and allow me, an old man, a nice castle where I will spend time with my horses, riding horses and enjoying the scenery. And go there, cut connections with capital, and you will probably die a natural death in old age, in comfort and respect, and secure yourself a good place in the history textbooks.
All right, last question, Andre, very quickly. But I've said for years now that North Korea has the very best foreign policy of any nation, the most brilliant,
Yes.
because
Yes.
they have just a very clear-eyed, ruthless pursuit of their objectives, and using blackmail, using all sorts of threats and missile launches, nuclear tests to try to get whatever they need and whatever they want without ever making any concessions. Do you agree with me, or is that a wrong-headed view?
And it's one of the reasons. I think, first of all, North Korea has a brilliant foreign policy team. These people, the North Korean diplomats, who are very often seen as, laughing stock. When it comes to the real business, they are probably one of the world's best teams ever. And it has been the case for decades. And you mentioned one of the reasons, because they have very little kind of, forbidden things which they don't do. But it's only one of the reasons. Other reason is that because it's a dictatorship and a very stable dictatorship, it's possible to plan for decades ahead. Decades may be a bit of an overstatement because the world is way too unpredictable. But if you're an American diplomat, you basically have to plan for maybe a couple of electoral cycles at most. In North Korea, you can plan for 10, 15, 20 years. People are not changing much. So people have a great deal of expertise. In the United States, I've been dealing with the US bureaucracy for quite closely, for quite closely. For 20 years, I see the same picture. After elections, new people come and they learn. They repeat the same mistakes. Somehow they believe that they are so smarter than their predecessors, so they believe that they will not repeat the mistakes, that they will find some ways, and they try something which have been tried many times, it doesn't work, of course, and so on. North Koreans don't have this problem. They have a kind of massive experience created and maintained.
Purges are not common these days.
Not common. You basically, in this case, Kim was quite angry, but it's another part of the story. And on top of that, government pays, because most of North Korean history, the economy was grossly inefficient. So the country was surviving largely through its ability to squeeze aid from the outside world. Therefore, people whose profession was to squeeze this aid, and in the end of the day, North Korean diplomacy is first about security and second about aid maximizing. And people who are very good in squeezing aid from the outside world, well, they had chances to get promotion and they were doing it very well because it was high priority area. And for many countries, for most countries, the foreign policy is not necessarily the major concern, including the United States. For North Korea, it's a major concern. If the diplomats don't come out with some clever schemes of playing a couple of great powers against another couple of great powers, squeezing money from both sides, well, the people will starve to death. So their job is taken seriously, and it's highly competitive, and these people are under great pressure, but they also rewarded well for their success.
Well, It is because of that pragmatism that Sergey and I think that there is a chance to make a deal, and
Yes,
hopefully the new team will
yeah,
try to pursue it.
yeah. And as I always say, at the same time, they will outsmart Americans. They will outsmart Russians and Chinese too, don't worry. They will outsmart everybody because of everything we have just discussed. But deal is still possible. It's still possible. But don't hope that they can be misled, duped into some silly decisions. They will have. Actually, they are playing with very little resources, but they're remarkably successful. Remarkably.
All right. Well, on that note, Andrei, thank you so much. This has been so insightful. You're such a wealth of
Thank
knowledge.
you.
I hope you'll come back. Sergey, always a pleasure. We should keep doing more writing together, even if it's getting people angry here in Washington.
It's our job, Dmitri, to get people angry.
Yeah, exactly. To get them to think outside the box. But thank you both, and looking forward to
Thank
more
you.
conversations.
Thank you. Yeah,
Take
thank
care.
you.